Hello, comrades. Welcome to our new series on Marx and Marxism. So we believe it's very important to understand some of the basic ideas that both Marx and Engels developed. And this is actually something we're going to be looking at today concretely, is the working relationship and personal relationship between Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, or Frederick Engels, as you call him here, who had a very close relationship. And just talking to somebody about postal service the other day, it can take something now 4 weeks to get something through to Germany. And Marx and Engels, when they were communicating with each other and sending letters, they often had like 3 times a day that the post delivered, which I find quite fascinating, because that's much better now as it is. It's much better then than it is today. Okay, without further ado, Kevin Bean will look at the subject of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Thank you very much. Welcome, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Just as an aside on the postal service, we must be grateful that there weren't telephones for much of Marx and Engels' life. Although I think right at the end of Engels' life, he actually did have a telephone. So you could imagine that their communications would have been quite instant, but we would have had a lot of information missing. So we must be grateful for small mercies. But you're right, they did correspond. Someone has calculated that they never wrote less than maybe about 2 or 3 letters a week to each other, and sometimes they might write a couple of times a day. So the communications were quite important. Today's talk is about Marx and Engels, but it really is also looking at some of the things that influenced them, and a couple of introducing some of the themes that will come up later on in some of the other discussions that we're having, particularly when we look at Marx and religion, Marx and nature, and also the later sections of dialectics. When I was thinking about today's session, I looked back over some of the more recent books on both Marx and Engels, and although many of them are, not always politically sympathetic, they do, I think, show that both men are politically still very significant. And whenever there's a major crisis in capitalist society, you come across articles and so forth in major newspapers pointing out the importance of Marx and Marxism. Indeed, in one of the recent accounts, George Soros, in conversation with some American politicians, advised them to read Marx on the grounds that he understood how capitalism operated, and if they were going to save it, then they should try and look at him. But let's hope they don't take his advice. Marx and Engels were very close comrades and collaborators. They first met in 1845, and although they were both Germans, they came from very different backgrounds, but they also shared, I think, many similarities. And I think what's interesting is that they reflect some of the developments in European socialism, and indeed in German philosophy and German theoretical work at the time. As is the way of these things, looking back in later years, Engels said that he and Marx sort of hit it off fairly quickly, and that within a matter of weeks, they essentially agreed to work together. And indeed, that's what they did for much of their life. In the earlier period, from 1845 to about 1849, they were involved in revolutionary groups, involved in the production of the Communist Manifesto. And after 1849, when Marx moved permanently to Britain, he and Engels were then in quite close communication with each other. In the literature, particularly the academic literature, Engels has, I think, come in for some criticism. And indeed, it draws our attention to one of the problems that socialist activists and those who, haven't had the benefits, and I say that sometimes sarcastically, of the you know, a university or an education in philosophy or politics and so on. Because there's an industry, there's almost a sort of Marx and Engels industry of books and articles and of magazines and academic journals, all I think attempting to look at you know, not only various aspects of Marx and Engels' work, but in many ways to refute it or to point out its weaknesses. And even people who are sympathetic to Marxism, you know, have often attempted to sort of prize Marx and Engels apart. And in particular, a theme which has grown stronger, I think, in recent years, and particularly since the 1960s, is to try to set up a sort of more humanistic Marx, indeed to set up a younger Marx who is a humanist, he's an idealist, with a tremendous emphasis on spontaneity and agency, and to set that against Engels, who's much more dogmatic, indeed is influenced by English positivism, the idea of systematizing ideas, and of reducing Marxism, or indeed of producing a system called Marxism, which reduces Marxism to some sort of dogma, and particularly very closely related to the natural sciences. The argument goes that that Engels, in particular, with his revisions of Capital, and indeed with the fact that he lived for 10, 14 years after Marx, was in a position to influence the reception of Marx's ideas. And then through Engels, through German social democracy, through people like Kautsky, he then goes on to influence the way that European Marxists understand Marxism. Now, those are all points of discussion, and we can perhaps take them up, but I'm going to argue that this is not in fact true. It's not really an accurate reading. And one of the reasons why I don't think it is an accurate reading is for the reasons that Tina alluded to right at the beginning. Marx and Engels are in really quite constant contact with each other. And it's very clear that they come from very similar philosophical and political traditions, and in a way are almost in the position of twins, the way that people who are very close to each other can almost intuit what the other people the other person is thinking, can almost finish their sentences and so on. This isn't to say that they're the same person, and indeed they're very different characters, and you know, there are very clear personal differences between them. But I think that they work very closely together, and I think that we can think of their politics and of their arguments as really being, you know, in a sense, a coherent whole. I think the other issue, and this is perhaps a more genuine or indeed, you know, more accurate summation, is a lot of the work produced by Marx and Engels, particularly by Marx, didn't see the light of day, certainly for the general public, until the 20th century. If you were a Marxist in any of the social democratic parties, and in those days, in the late 19th and early 20th century, that meant a communist or a Marxist. If you were, for example, in the German SPD, you would be familiar with you know, the Communist Manifesto. You would be familiar perhaps with some of Marx's writings on economics. You might be familiar with some of his journalism. You would obviously be familiar in the case of Engels with things like Anti-Düring, which is a polemic against a right-wing German socialist in the 1880s, The Origins of the Family, The State and Private Property. You'd be familiar with the major works, but much of the philosophical and political background that I'm going to refer to today would not have been published. And indeed, much of the material, for example, the Grundrisse, the sort of outline of Marx's ideas that is going to be, I think, significant in contributing to Capital in the 1860s, that didn't really appear in a form that could be easily read and understood until, I think, the 1960s. And indeed, important documents like the economic and philosophical manuscripts of the 1840s weren't published until 1932, and the German ideology, I think, was another piece that didn't appear until the 1920s. In other words, we have, I think, a much wider view of what constitutes the background and the ideas of Marx than many of the people who were politically active in the 19th century and indeed for much of the 20th century. And I think it's this that can sometimes lead people to argue that the forms of Marxism develop are not as rich and indeed as complex as they could be. In other words, that they've been simplified. Now, again, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that either. If we look at the theoretical work of the German Social Democrats, particularly in the journal Die Neue Zeit, the sort of theoretical magazine, there were quite complex and developed arguments, and that type of Marxism was, I think, influential, certainly influential on Lenin and others. So I've given some of the background. If you want to read up more, and I'm going to refer to a number of publications, I've put some extracts up on the website, and Tina will release those, I think, after the talk. You might also look at the Marxist Internet Archive, which has got many of the translations into English. But the Marx and Engels collected works in English, I think, only run to about 50 volumes. The collected works that are being produced in Amsterdam run to around about 120 volumes at the moment, and there's still quite a lot to get through. So you can see that we're talking about a very complex body of work, and anything that we might say about it, certainly at the in a meeting like this, will be very partial in this way. So let's try and locate these two people. First of all, they are roughly about the same age. Marx is born in 1888 in southwestern Germany, in Trier, in the sort of Mosel area, and Engels comes from Barmen, which is a bit further to the north in the Ruhr area. Barmen is an industrializing area at the time, and indeed his family are cotton spinners, industrialists, and he's born into a fairly comfortable bourgeois family. Essentially a German entrepreneur. Engels is quite comfortably off, or certainly comfortably off in comparison with the majority of the German population. Marx comes from a slightly more provincial background in some ways, although Trier itself is actually the oldest German city. It's a Roman city and a great sense of itself and its history. It was also an area which during the French Revolutionary period had been under French control, and in that way had in many ways been shaped by the ideas of the French Revolution. Many of its leading citizens, including Marx's father and indeed his father-in-law, von Westphalen, were influenced by that period. And although they were fairly moderate in their expressions, they would clearly be what we might nowadays think of as liberals and progressives. The other difference between the two men is that Marx's family background was Jewish. His father converted from Judaism to Protestantism. Although Trier is a predominantly Catholic area, the type of Protestantism, the Lutheranism that his father formally adopted would, I suppose, be of a fairly liberal, and indeed, almost, I think, moving towards forms of agnosticism. Certainly, it was it was not a clear sort of belief. I think it would be someone described saying that this Protestantism was a la Lessing, of a very sort of liberal nature. both men then don't come from the proletariat, and that's often used against them. I never really understood that argument, but they are from the educated and the comfortable sections of society. But they're also very much in tune with the ferment of ideas that's going on in Germany, you know, both in their teenage years and indeed in their early adulthood. Marx is, I think, influenced by the politics of his father and of the area, and particularly influenced by opposition to the Prussian regime. And again, as Mark explained last week, Germany as a unified state doesn't exist. It's under all sorts of petty kingdoms, although some of them are not so petty and some of them are not so tolerant, and Prussia comes into the latter form. So ideas of freedom, particularly freedom of expression, opposition to censorship, and I think above all, the nature of the state and how the state should be and how it should had organized itself were really very central. A rather neglected area, just by the by, is Marx's journalism. In the 1840s, he's the editor of a newspaper in Cologne, the Rheinische Zeitung, which is a sort of liberal newspaper, and he writes, you know, considerable articles about social and economic and political conditions, and it's here that we see his ideas forming. And I wanted to stress this aspect because it's very easy to see Marx as some sort of theorist, and I will look at the theoretical sides of it in a moment. But he's also an active journalist, writing articles, having to keep to deadlines, and trying to explain his politics and his ideas in an article form. Although Engels once said that he was a pretty rubbish editor, that he would take a whole day to laboring over an editorial, which would take somebody else a couple of hours. And this apparently was because he was very precise, but also because Engels said that he always wanted to bring in the world historical nature of most questions. So there are probably lessons in editorializing and writing for some of us there. So Marx is born in an area in which the memories of the French Revolution, the ideas of the Enlightenment, and the possibilities of different forms of society are around. You know, his father is clearly influenced by that, father-in-law as well, although, again, to add a little spice to the story, one of his brothers-in-law, Ferdinand, Jenny von Westphalen's half-brother, later becomes a prominent Prussian reactionary. And he, in the best sort of romantic novel, he tries to stop the affair between Jenny and Karl. But the family are fairly happy with Karl, who's, although, you know, slightly wild and so forth, you know, is clearly a man of some talent and ability. Now, Marx was sort of destined to follow the family line of being a lawyer, and went off initially to Bonn. Again, one comrades who were in one of the sessions the last time may well remember that Ben Lewis referred to his old University of Bonn and the dueling scars and so forth. And he generally seemed to have had a bit of a wild time there. One of the things about Marx and Engels was that they were fairly human in their pleasures and so on. And like most German students of the period, they liked a pint and also, I suppose, doing rather student-type things, certainly of that era. Very much the Student Prince, for those of us of an older generation remember that musical. But Marx's father tried to clamp down on this and then sent him off to Berlin, which again, the capital of Prussia, had a fairly sort of repressive military atmosphere, and hoped that sending him there would calm him down. But actually made things worse, in the sense that Marx began to get in touch with much more radical political and philosophical ideas. In particular, the ideas of a group of young intellectuals. Some of them were young university academics, others of them were sort of students or would-be students. And it was here that he began to develop an interest in philosophy. And indeed, he began to think about how philosophical ideas and how we might interpret the world could then be a means and a guide to changing it. To sort of move back to Engels just for a moment, Engels' background was much more conventional. He, again, completed a good education, but didn't receive a university education. He went and did his military service. And as luck would have it, although they didn't meet at that time, he did his military service in Berlin. And in Berlin, he too came into contact with the so-called young Hegelians or left Hegelians. And it was there that he began to see this link between understanding the world and changing it, or at least began to sort of grapple with these problems. Indeed, of the two, probably Marx was the more significant. He was the better known. We have contemporary accounts of him being a fairly imposing, if wild figure, you know, holding forth in discussions, you know, challenging ideas, and in many ways being recognized as something of a philosophical authority, even though he was still technically a student. He passed through the ranks of academia. He got a doctorate from the University of Jena, and his doctoral thesis was again in philosophy, and it was looking at some rather technical issues in ancient Greek philosophy. We have only a fragment of the thesis, but we can see that even here in the early 1840s, that Marx is concerned with understanding, I suppose, the material world and its relationship to thought, or thought and the material world, and I suppose trying to look at the way that that philosophy in the classical world was trying to form that relationship between thought and action. Having completed his doctorate, he hoped for an academic job. That didn't materialize. The Prussian censorship was fairly rigorous, and with a number of other young Hegelians, they were effectively excluded from academic life. And then that left him, I suppose, not at a loose end, but at a thinking about where he could, you know, put forward his ideas. And that, of course, led to journalism. And it was in Cologne that the paper I've already mentioned, the Rheinische Zeitung, where he began to attempt to look at this relationship between his philosophy and understanding of the world and some form of action. Now, we're going to talk about philosophy. I think Matthew Jones is going to do a session on that. And I think I will leave quite a lot of that to Matthew and to the discussion that we have then. But I think there are a couple of things that we need perhaps to understand about the influence of Hegel and the impact that this had on both Marx and Engels. Interestingly, writing, I think in the 1870s, Engels, in one of his books on the German Peasant War, talked about the importance of philosophy and theory. And since our comrade chair this evening is from Germany, I thought she might enjoy this. And Engels is talking here about the relationship between philosophy and theory and politics. And he says, the German workers have two important advantages over those of the rest of Europe. First, they belong to the most theoretical people of Europe, and they've retained that sense of theory which the so-called educated classes of Germany have almost completely lost. Without German philosophy, which preceded it, particularly that of Hegel, German scientific socialism, the only scientific socialism that has ever existed, would never have come into being. Without a sense of theory among the workers, this scientific socialism would never have entered their flesh and blood as much as is the case. What an immeasurable advantage this is may be seen, on the one hand, from the indifference towards all theory, which is one of the main reasons why the English working class movement crawls along so slowly in spite of the splendid organization of the individual unions. On the other hand, from the mischief and confusion wrought by Prudenism in its original forms among the French and the Belgians, and in the form further caricatured by Bakunin among the Spaniards and the Italians. So why I think that's interesting is that in that piece, Engels goes on to say that the struggle for socialism is both political and economic, but he also says it's theoretical. And the type of theory that both Marx and Engels are very much grounded in was influenced by the philosophy of Hegel. And we all know the cliches about Marx turning Hegel on his head and so on. But I think what we're really looking at here is the idea of contradictions, and particularly the idea of dialectics, of movement, of processes of change. And that in particular, what we're often used to in a very common sense view of the world is of fixed categories of things which are tables and chairs and books and so on and so forth. We're used to fairly rigid and fixed categories. And obviously English empiricism, the ideas of being able to measure and being able to understand clearly and so forth were very important. But the idea of movement and of change, and particularly a very important idea, the idea of the unity of opposites, that often within a process or within a form that you have its opposite. And Hegel, for example, talks famously about the master-slave dialectic, that the master and the slave are actually mutually dependent, although the relationships of power are different between each one. And if you think about, again, I'm thinking of the sort of Marxist classes I would have attended many years ago. But if you think about, the idea of becoming, that the moment that we're born, we're beginning to die, and the relationship between our current state and our moving state, between our aging, so that at any one time, a human being is not the same as that human being was a moment ago, and will not be the same. Now, these are all very sort of trite ways of explaining it. But I think what Marx got from Hegel was this idea of a process of change. Now, Hegel in various ways was both a very conservative philosopher, and indeed at one point when he was effectively a sort of official ideologist of the Prussian government, he was very much supported the status quo. But by the time that Marx came into touch with his ideas, and particularly with the young Hegelian movement, those ideas of change were in fact potentially destabilizing, if not revolutionary. And indeed, many of Hegel's followers were not only censored, but actually imprisoned. So the implications of this conception of the world, that the world, far from being sort of fixed and stable, was actually in a constant process of change, and that indeed within any society, within any form, the ways of the processes of change could throw up different forms in contradiction with each other. Now, the other idea, which is an interesting one, and since we have a German speaker, I'm sure Tina may be able to enlighten us in the discussion, is a very simple German word, which means at least around about 13 different things, which is Aufheben. And it's the idea which we might translate as sublimation, sublation, consummation, resolution, supersession. In other words, the idea of both something coming from within, but also, in a sense, becoming something different. And it's from this where we get the very simplified views of Marxist ideas, or of Hegelian dialectics of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And Aufheben, I think, again, influences Marx's political ideas, the idea of movement, but of movement to where, and above all, the idea of a sort of resolution of contradictions. For example, contradictions in society between rich and poor, between worker and capitalist, as examples. How are those contradictions to be resolved? Well, we know that Marx talks about the contradictions in society being resolved by the overthrow of capitalism, and then the transition to other forms of society. And of course, he then sees the history, as the Communist Manifesto opens with, the history of all hitherto existing societies has been one of class struggle. The idea of social change. Now, those ideas to us, I think, are now so much part of our DNA that when we read it, we can't really grasp the revolutionary impact they would have had. Even supporters of capitalism now recognize that their system is revolutionary, that it changes, that it in a constant process of change, that again, to quote from the manifesto, all that is solid melts into air, that what we thought of was once sound and fixed will be transformed. So this idea, of course, was revolutionary, because in the existing orders of the 19th century, the emphasis was on stability, and particularly given the impact of religious ideas of a transcendent God, of in a sense a reality beyond the material world. So when we look at a document like the Communist Manifesto, or when we read some of Marx's pamphlets, we find that those Hegelian ideas actually present there. And although it's an echo, it's a very important echo. And of course, to people that Engels is describing there, who are immersed in this philosophy, then in a sense it becomes sort of a second nature. So this philosophical tradition, I think, is important. It's the application of philosophy and of those ideas, to political problems. And of course, that's the cliche. Again, all of these aphorisms we know very well, where Marx says the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And it's that relationship of revolutionary practice, of thought and action, that I think is quite central here. Marx, very quickly moves to the idea that not only can he interpret the world, but he and other people acting politically and socially can change it. And that idea is not born, as I read recently from his studies in the British Museum. It's actually born from what he sees around him, and indeed what he experiences as a newspaper editor, but also as a political activist. Now, if we have the theoretical Marx, we also have the theoretical Engels, and also the practical Engels as well. Marx and Engels meet for the first time in 1845 in Paris, and they've both written, although I don't think they knew each other when they wrote it, in a journal, the Deutsche Französische Jahrbuch, which is a sort of philosophical magazine. They both contributed articles to it, although Marx was much more important in terms of being the editor of it. But from that meeting, they began to cooperate and work together. And under the influence of what they saw in Paris, they began very rapidly to move towards a systematic form of communism. In one of the readings that I suggested for this talk by Lenin, called The Three Sources and Component Parts of Marxism, Lenin describes Marxism as being a synthesis or being influenced by German philosophy, but he also mentions French socialism as well, and also English economics, which I'll come on to, I hope, in a minute. Yes, it will have to be a minute as well, I can see.
Take your time, comrade.
In Paris, Marx is in contact with a whole series of socialist circles, and these French socialists, of course, are very significant. Although their names have now sort of really just become footnotes, these are people who do imagine and, in a sense, foresee a socialist or a communist future. People like Saint-Simon, Fourier, and of course in Britain, Robert Owen. And indeed, although Marx and Engels, Engels particularly in a section taken from Anti-Düring, criticizes the utopians, as indeed is done in the Communist Manifesto, the important function that these socialists have in a sense looking to the future and raising the possibilities of a communist society are very important. The other theme, I think, is that Marx is increasingly aware that these utopians, in a sense, have a blueprint. And if you remember, in one of our sessions last autumn, Mark Mulholland did a very good introduction to socialist ideas and talked about these various groups. They often had blueprints, but the means of actually achieving that blueprint were unclear. Some talked about the possibilities of a military coup, the Blanquists, who were, I think, in some ways influenced by Babeuf and so on. We looked at those too. But I think what Marx begins to see is the possibilities of taking the theoretical ideas of socialism and developing them into a mass political movement. And why he thinks this is possible is not that this will be carried out by intellectuals necessarily, although he thinks that theory is very important, but he thinks that it is quite possible, given the nature of capitalist society, for the working class to, in a sense, become the masters of society, in a sense, to develop the consciousness to rise to that task. And this is where I think we start to see the application of Hegelian ideas of development, of process, that capitalism is creating a working class, that that industrialization is revolutionizing society. Again, the sections from the Communist Manifesto talk about this changing world. And again, I didn't really draw on that, but if you think about the 1840s in Britain and in Europe, you're seeing tremendous economic and social changes. You know, the world really is being revolutionized. And so the possibilities of change, the possibilities of the working class becoming the new leading class in society, created by capitalism, in other words, arising from within one social form, is the basis for the next social form, the unity of opposites, and then the idea of the negation as well. So you can see that what was happening all around would seem to confirm some of the points that Marx was thinking about theoretically. But there was also another element which convinced him, and which he brought together, I think, magnificently in the Communist Manifesto. And this was, of course, the theoretical analysis of capitalism, particularly carried out by bourgeois economists. And those were predominantly in what he called England. We might nowadays think of as Britain, given the role of Adam Smith from Scotland, but even so. The idea of the nature of capitalism, the tendencies within capitalism, and in particular, drawing on the work of economists like Ricardo, the nature of value and the role of the working class in creating capital and indeed in the production of values, the labor theory of value. So what we have then, I think, is in the world that Marx and Engels are living in, is this ferment of ideas, but their individual abilities are in bringing those ideas together and indeed seeing the connections and in a way synthesizing it and then turning it, I think, into a political program and a set of coherent political ideas. Now, Engels' role in all of this is, I think, quite considerable. I said that he in 1845, and very shortly they visited Britain. They visited Manchester in particular. These were the days when Manchester was the burgeoning industrial power. And if you wanted to see the modern world, if you wanted to see the future, you came to Manchester. Now, Engels' contribution to the development of Marxism was, I think, in his practical links and his practical understanding of that world. And this wasn't just because he was a capitalist. In later years, when he returned to the family firm and was involved in making profit, and thereby, taking part in capitalism quite directly, he was able to provide plenty of examples to Marx. He was able to talk about the nature of the market. He was able to provide Marx almost with sort of up-to-date information about how contemporary capitalism was operating. Although Marx also drew much of his source from what he called the blue books, the magnificent official publications of the British government, which provided him with immense amounts of statistical information that he could use to theorize. But Engels also, through his life in Britain, and also through the personal contacts that he made, had gained a very clear understanding of the nature of the working class movement and of working class life. And in the extracts I've selected there, I've included a section from The Condition of the Working Class in England, which was quite a well-known book. Indeed, Engels made sufficient royalties from it to finance some political activities. But more importantly, Engels not only understood and in a sense delved into the life of the working class, but he also had personal contacts with the leading elements in Chartism. And I want to just emphasize that, because the Chartist movement, which we had a talk on just before Christmas, I think Rob Sewell talked about the nature of the Chartist movement. That movement was the world's first working class political party. And this again was the embodiment of the potential of the working class as political agents for their own emancipation. So the Communist Manifesto is saturated with that idea. It isn't just a theory that the proletariat can act politically somewhere distantly into the future. It's actually based upon what Marx and Engels saw in the Chartist movement. And Engels had these personal contacts with leading Chartists, and indeed during their visit to Britain in 1845, they met leading Chartists and discussed with them. And indeed Engels and Marx as well made some contributions to Chartist newspapers. Engels also, I think, provided other elements in the development of Marx's work. We know, I suppose, of their personal relationship. We know that in terms of money, the precarious nature of the Marx family finances, and the fact that Engels would slip him a fiver from time to time. We're very well aware of that. We're also, I think, less aware of the sort of role that Engels plays in providing Marx with information on military and diplomatic affairs. And that, I think, again, is important. Engels had done military service. He had taken part in the 1848-49 revolutionary movement. He fought in Baden. That, again, is an important element in contributing to the understanding of the wider context for Marx. The relationship between the two, and I'm obviously really only going up to the Communist Manifesto, but I do want to just point on, just by way of conclusion, the relationship between the two was, I think, was a close one. We've talked about their frequent writing to each other, visits. Again, the various recent biographies, even the one by Tristram Hunt, who was a Blairite Labour MP, does have some value in that regard. Rachel Holmes' biography of Jenny Marx all point to sort of Frederick Engels as a member of the family, as someone who was part of the much wider Marx circle. And that, I think, is very important. And of course, although deeply committed politically, and also I think really quite close comrades in arms, also I think very very good friends. The reminiscences that are on the list there, particularly of the German socialist leader Wilhelm Liebknecht, the father of Karl, point to them having quite an interesting social life on the occasions when they got together in London, going for a few pints and just carrying out some minor vandalism on the Tottenham Court Road with street lamps. Obviously not a revolutionary act, but it does show that even great Marxists are not sort of plaster saints. Not to be advocated, but possibly after a boisterous night of smoking and drinking and an argument in the pubs of North London or just around the Euston Road, then you could get up to all sorts of things. So, comrades, I'm going to wind up there. I've gone on for a little longer. I've actually only done one page of the 7 pages of notes, but perhaps it will come up in the questions. Anyway, thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kevin. I would urge comrades not to vandalize street lights, but choose some, slave traders statues or something. I think that's the thing we're going for these days. I thought that was really fascinating, Kevin. How I think you really brought out the two key elements there of Marx and Engels' contribution. Firstly, explaining how capitalism works, and I urge comrades who haven't read Capital yet and are a bit struggling trying to get past chapter 3, which is usually the one where people get stuck. Try it with David Harvey, who's doing a fantastic online reading group, and his videos are on our website as well. And then secondly, of course, developing how Marx and Engels developed a method of how to overcome capitalism, not a blueprint, which many other socialists, so-called socialists, had done, or anarchists, but an actual method on how to overcome it. And there's a question in the Q&A, which I might have a little go at answering, which is can you describe in 2 short sentences dialectical materialism, which is we're having a session on all of that on March 11. And there are short sentences, but I think it opens up a whole can of worms, similar to when Kevin mentioned aufheben, the word aufheben, which is actually goes to the heart of it. Yes, which there is no English word for it. It actually kind of means pick up, but you pick something up to then supersede it, to neutralize it, perhaps, to run with it and do something with it, to change it. I think to overcome or supersede, I think, is quite are the best translations. And I know that Engels used abolish in the Communist Manifesto. He authorized to use when it comes to the question of the family. he used abolish the family, which in the original German was aufheben, which is quite different actually. Abolish the family sounds like, oh, it's illegal now, you can't, do away with marriage and that kind of thing. But to aufheben actually does mean more like to overcome and to move towards something better, a better relationship between men and women, which is definitely desirable. So that would be a different formulation for that. Dialectics, unity of opposites, penetration of opposites. I can't even say it. Interpretation of opposites. Always makes me think of the yin and yang symbol. You have everything contains within it the seed of its own destruction. You're born and you have to die. And I think concretely Marx and Engels used it in terms of the capitalism produces the working class, gives birth to the working class, which is its gravedigger. The working class is the gravedigger of capitalism, and capitalism has produced it. Without the working class, capitalism can't exist, but it will be the working class that does away with it eventually. We're not quite there yet, but it's important to understand all of this. So thank you very much, Kevin. Tony has a question, but comrades, if you have contributions or comments, please raise your hand. There's also a question here in the Q&A on have we seen Young Marx and what do you think about it, the film? I actually haven't, but maybe Kevin has. I'm going to bring in Tony now.
Okay, well, thank you, Tina. Fascinating talk, Kevin. Tina took the words literally out of my mouth because I was going to talk about the working class being brought into being as the gravediggers of capitalism. But shall I just stop while Kevin takes...
Kevin can't see his screen and he's trying to restart his computer. He just phoned me. But
oh, right. Shall I wait?
Perhaps that's not a bad idea.
Yeah. I can see Kevin, so he must...
He can't see us, and I think he can't. But perhaps, Kevin, if you can hear us, we could continue, and I could bring you in or something, so that we don't have to stop the meeting now. What do you think, Kevin? Or would you rather try and log off?
He's on mute at the moment, so
yeah. Well, why don't you carry on speaking, Tony? And
okay. Well, my question really is this. Maybe you can rephrase it or repeat it if Kevin can't hear it now. The whole basis of Marxism, in a sense, was, as you say, that it brought into being the proletariat, who would achieve a consciousness, a political consciousness, which was a precondition, really, for revolutionary change. But how would you see the present situation whereby there's been quite a conscious, if not ruling class strategy? It's a consequence also of the information technology revolution, whereby the working class has become atomized. We no longer have the great masses of workers in the dockers and the mines and the shipyards and so on, who engaged in mass struggles and strikes with the capitalists. I mean, in a sense, that's been exported to the third world. We have a mass general strike in India of 250 million people, but in Britain, we've had a continuum for the last 35 years, really, since the miners' strike, with very little industrial disruption. How does that relate to the original Marxist theory of the proletariat being the agent of change? I don't know whether Kevin's heard any of that, but
I think you might.
Yeah, okay. I think that means yes.
Yeah, I think it does. Yes, I think that's a good question, isn't it, as well? Do you have to be well off? I mean, Marx and Engels were obviously clearly quite well off in order to afford.
So all revolutionaries have to be well off in order to engage in revolution.
No, that's a question, isn't it? You need some kind of free time to develop those ideas. Okay, sorry, I still can't pronounce your name. I've had it a few times. Is the next speaker.
Hi, yes. I've got a very short intervention, but I think when Kevin talked about the different philosophical contributions and looked at British and Adam Smith, he ignored the ideas that were in the history of moral sentiments that Adam Smith also wrote, as well as The Wealth of Nations, because in that he talks about how the person has a responsibility to work together with other people because to our mutual benefit, because without that, there is no moral basis for humanity and how to sort those kind of things out. In a similar way, Hegel had the idea of the unity of opposites and the synthesis and the history of class struggles was also a dialectical trend within Hegel. And so that was continued in a more material way by Marx and Engels. So I think there is a lot of joined up thinking across all those philosophies, and they crossed each other quite a lot. And I think that therefore, you know, we can't just say that the British were behind the German philosophers in the sense of looking at both morals and economics and practical things. And so I just wanted to add a bit more subtlety to the separate categories that he was talking about, because the categories in Hegel as well were there. And there's also the whole thing about how you see the family being different units and the state. And of course, Hegel thought that one had to work our way up through a good moral self work on your own way that you treat other people to and the ultimate would be the absolute being, rather than a sort of spiritual, rather than the practical clash of economic and historical forces. So that was my idea.
Thank you, Comrade. Kevin, do you want to come back and reply to a few things? No. Is that a no or yes? Sorry. I can see you shaking it. Sorry. I think that's a, I'm not sure. I think I'm just going to bring in Steve Freeman. Hi, Steve.
Comrades, first of all, Kevin, that was really good. I enjoyed that and filled in lots of gaps and thoughts. So well done for that. I've got two short points, really. The first one is just to emphasize a point that Tina already made, and to contrast the idea of abolishing things, abolishing the state, abolishing classes, abolishing religions and things like that, which in a way seems to sound rather dictatorial, as if we could bring something in that could make it pass a decree, and then that decree would make these things disappear by abolition of them, you know, by command almost, possibly slightly Stalinist in its thoughts. But the idea that things are going to be overcome or are going to wither away, you know, the withering away of the state, the overcoming of religion, even the transcendence or overcoming of capitalism as an idea, implies that it's not an event, but it's a process of struggle. In other words, even as the working classes come into power, there's a process going on of transcending or overcoming the process. It's not an event, it's a continuous process. So I think that's to get away from abolishing things and get, so I think that word that Tina explained to us, I think is and the point she made, I think is absolutely right and very, very important. It's a process, and therefore we have to look at contradictions. Second point, I just wanted to address, I think, what Tony said, and something occurred to me today. So obviously technology destroys forms of workplace organization, working class organization, destroys jobs, but it also raises productivity to a higher level and therefore makes us more interconnected than we were before. So as well as the atomization process, there's also a process going on at the same time when we become more interdependent and more connected, and therefore the links between the working class are in some ways stronger. Just to give an example, that I saw just the other day that there was a massive meeting, I don't know what the number was, of teachers on Zoom. And I think it was like 100,000 people. It may have even been more than that. It was a very large number of teachers got together to discuss COVID. And they decided they would take action in a way that would not have been possible to have like a mass meeting at that level. And then they used it locally to organize locally. And then they turned around and said, well, we're not going to go into these COVID schools. So when the Tories decided to close the schools, or well, they haven't really closed them, but when they decided to take action against the schools, it was because the teachers were more organized now than they maybe have been for many years. Technology has facilitated perhaps more interconnection between them than we've seen. So it's a two-sided process that's going on. So I don't think the loss of maybe the big factories means that the working class is potentially more interconnected and potentially more powerful than it was before. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. I'm afraid Kevin has some issues with his computer and he's trying to restart it. Well, anyway, I'll bring in Paul Fletcher now.
Hi, thank you, Kevin, for a very stimulating talk. Two areas I've been interested in. One is counter-revolution. I think Marx and Engels lived through periods of counter-revolution, both in Prussia and France and Russia with Alexander II. But the parallel today with counter-revolution, we see, I forget the name, the Wide Boys or something storming the Capitol. And I was thinking, are there lessons to be learned about right-wing populism and how after a period of progressive politics, right-wing populism seems to take hold again. They have easy messages, simple messages to give to the populace. So we see a pattern of the Trump and the neoliberals, if you like, sorting out things in very pretty words. And that can be attractive to a disenfranchised working class. And so then, but when the right are failing, then they usually take to the streets as they did after their small majority in 1933, or 1933 was it? They took their army onto the streets and got rid of the opposition. So I was thinking more in contemporary work terms. Neoliberalism also survives by omission and also just not acknowledging that socialism exists in a way. My second question, I'm sorry I'm a bit long-winded, but is about colonialism and Marx and Engels' views on colonialism weren't all negative, apparently at one time. Engels and Marx thought that certain areas of the world could do with modernization, and these people could be improved by industrial technology. But I think they also came to see very clearly that, you know, with the uprisings in India in 1840, 57, the cruelty of the oppressive colonizers, and also in Ireland as well. So I'd be interested to know, Kevin, or thoughts on those two areas. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. I think you summed it up. I think they believed at the time they might have something progressive, but then noticed they didn't have that much progressive about it. But Kevin will get back to you, I'm sure. Mark, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Steve Freeman made an important point. So I just want to add something really to what he said about the fact that although old industries that brought people, that made a collective, the capitalism made a collective out of that working class. And with the development of capitalism, there's quote unquote deindustrialization, although I think that's a bit of an iffy term, how that has broken down. I wouldn't put it at this, I personally wouldn't explain it via this objective process. I think it's all about subjectivity. It's all about politics, and it's all about Stalinism, quite frankly, which Steve Freeman sort of mentioned in a way. Fundamentally, how the working class challenges things like the decline of various industries, the wiping out of other industries, the leveling down of conditions, etc., is a political one. And so therefore I would place fundamentally the blame at the door of Stalin.
Oh no.
And it's absolutely its response to things like this, which is basically to create a national solution, which is hopeless. What this shows to us is what we actually need. What we actually need is more internationalism. On other things, just a couple
of Mark, you have to speak towards the computer, please. Otherwise,
sorry.
we can't hear you.
I'm very sorry. Sorry about that. That with Marx and Engels and the extraordinarily rich relationship, theoretical relationship, a sort of systematic theoretical challenge to capitalism emerges onto the world scene. And what I find interesting is, if you look at that period, how capitalism, even in the early days, reacted extraordinarily defensively. Leave aside 1917 and the fact that capitalism has been overthrown already. The theorists of capitalism were kind of edging towards or skirting around the idea of
Mark, speak towards the computer, please.
A labor theory of value. They immediately backed away when Marxism became a material force. And sometimes you will get people like Soros who talk about Marxism in a fairly, an admiring type of way. As individual human beings, they should read a little bit more of it in that sense. I mean, I picked up Soros's book and or one of his books, and in it he's got Marx saying that all property is theft, which is not Marx, it's Lassalle. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mark. There's a bit of a problem with your internet. I think you can keep getting stuck. Okay, Matthew, please.
Right, can you hear me, comments?
Yes, I can.
I did. I'm just going to follow on from Mark's contribution. I thought was interesting as well. And I think the important thing here is really also, beside the other side, of course, is beside development of Stalinism in the movement itself, is the development of finance capital and the move to finance capital, which of course is after Marx. So I do agree with him in terms of the impact of Marxism and systemically, and particularly actually the Paris Commune, which announces the working class as a force on the world stage, even though it's limited. I mean, the ruling class is bright enough to recognise that its challenger is coming on the stage, and that terrifies it. I think the other thing, of course, is that the other thing, as is also pointed out, of course, is the retreat by the ruling class from any form of serious investigation of the nature of the world. And okay, you have got an investigation on empirical level in terms of the science and so on, but very limited. And in fact, the whole cultural and so on, development of the society, if you look at it, is to say less and less. Actually nothing. I mean, if you look at the current output of Hollywood, it appears to be dedicated to say as little as possible about what actually happens in the world, and merely to distract people from what happens in the world. And the same for most social science departments in universities. They appear to not have anything serious to say about what actually goes on. I think in terms of finance capital, it's it marks the capitalists taking that move away from production, but it gives them that strategic view of the world and a strategic way of attacking the working class and its organisation. You quite clearly see that when I mean, particularly in the modern epoch, when obviously after the dissolution of Bretton Woods in the early 70s, that the ruling class moves directly to finance capital, and therefore quite consciously deindustrializes the US, the UK, chunks of other in particular, and moves itself towards finance capital, which is mobile, is not tied down to any particular industry or whatever else, can move to wherever, and can drive that process of atomizing the working class. Because it's a defensive move. The ruling class quite clearly understands from what has gone before that it is on borrowed time. It's trying to hold itself in power under conditions in which it understands that it's under threat all the time, and that's you can see that from the rotten nature of society we've got at the moment. The sort of attempted coup last week in Washington is another symptom of the pure social putrefaction. You can't call it else. It's utter rottenness, and this is in Marx also. I mean, this is Marx's great insight, that he sees society as an arc. It's a teleology. You can see the development of society in certain ways, and therefore he's incredibly good at predicting stuff. And it's then developed into the whole issue of the decline of he's looking at mature capitalism. We're looking at a capitalism in decline and decay, and hence you can see the differences between the two systems. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, the question is that capitalism is in decline, but can it actually be abolished without the working class being strong enough to do anything about it? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Okay, Marie, please.
Hello. Thank you for letting me speak. I think it was a beautiful introduction by Kevin. Worth going back all the time to these principles, because they allow to understand, when one can, how the processes unfold. And I would like to remind everybody, I know that it is generally known, but the question of what happened in the Soviet Union with the retreat of the revolution. Why there was a retreat? In the end, it was because the revolution was not extending worldwide. So it had to reduce and go backwards. This is not to excuse Stalin or Stalinism, but it is something which in every revolution you have a retreat, you have a thermidor, until there can be a new wave which picks up again and go further. And so I think it was important, the principles of the dialectic, as Kevin evoked them, for us to try to handle. I would like to invite the comrades to look again, what is the bureaucracy? Why was there a bureaucracy? Why was there a retreat in the Soviet Union? It was because there was a lack of conditions to advance. And so there was a negation, a partial negation of the advance of the enormous conquest which the worker state was. And in that retreat, am I speaking too long, Tina?
No, comrade, go ahead.
In that retreat, it didn't go back all the way. It didn't go back to the feudalism which it was, until 1917. It didn't go back all the way. It was stopped to a certain extent because there were the forces had been woken up, which includes the consciousness of the working class, which includes also the consciousness of the working class in the rest of the world and the formation of many communist parties. This was not permitting a complete retreat. And so you had all sorts of compenetration of opposites, which led to the bureaucracy, which is not a class. And I think it's important to remember that it is not a class, because between capitalism and the construction of communism or the worker state, there is not another class. You pass from one to the other, which is why it is so complicated, so deep, such a deep change. There is no, and the bureaucracy is only there because there has been a lack of advance. Yeah, and so I would like to conclude this by saying, without the dialectical method and without it being applied as Trotsky applied, Trotsky explains that much better than I do. So when one can understand what's happening today, for example, I don't think it's an accident that Russia is supporting places like Syria or Venezuela or Iran. It's not supporting Saudi Arabia. And so what's happened? There has been an advance, and that advance expresses itself to a degree in the sense that Russia and China are now supporting countries which are fighting imperialism. And I invite comrades to look again at what I'm saying and criticize it.
So what I wanted to say, I wanted to reply to Tony, because the question you raised, Tony, about the working class changing and there no longer being a militant working class, I think I agree more with Steve Freeman. Of course, the sort of militancy that we saw in the past is no longer there, and the working class itself today is very quiet. But the working class is organized in large sections, i.e. hospitals and schools. So much of working class these days, I mean, I don't know what proportion, but a very significant proportion are involved in fulfilling some sort of social needs. And obviously that's very important at the moment, given the pandemic. But I think that what we see is a shift. Obviously, alongside that, there has been the whole kind of 0 hours contract economy developing, but I think that there is still, you could say, public service is where the working class is concentrated now in Britain and in Ireland and in most other European countries. Obviously, the situation is different in places like China, where you would have huge factories of workers, and in India also. So the other thing I wanted to say was that what I think is interesting when you look at Marx and Engels, and like it came out in Kevin's talk, was the importance of politics and the importance of political struggle. And I think, and also the kind of, when Tina mentioned the whole Aufheben thing, the issue of the ability of the working class to supersede existing society on their own terms, in their own fashion, and the kind of contradictory nature of that. And I just give you an example just from Ireland at the moment, is that people will probably have seen that we've got yet another report has come out evidencing the abuse of unmarried mothers in Ireland for a period right up to the 1990s. And this is like, I think maybe the 7th report in 14 years evidencing the church's abuse of the working class, and mainly women. And what's interesting about that is it's produced a new kind of secularism in Ireland, where people who are being really critical of the church and of the state, and saying that the church should have no hand, act or part in education or in social provision going forward, are often themselves religious people still. So they may believe, but they don't want an establishment church. And I think that those kind of questions are very important, certainly in Ireland. I think that they're extremely important questions, and often the left isn't so interested in them because they're not economic questions, they're not trade union questions, but they're questions that go to the heart of where the way we live and the way we experience life. And to me, I think that that whole issue of religion and the kind of supersession of religion being about superseding it in terms of an established, and as an establishment, I think that that's extremely important, obviously here and in many other countries today. And thank you.
Thanks, comrades. My apologies for the technical problems. I did hear some of the comments, and I think that some of the contributions made, by comrades, I think, did move towards that. But I think the series is really, in a way, not just a sort of academic, chance to look at Marx, but it's looking at the relevance of Marxism. And I think the sort of questions that Tony asked are fairly common. And even though many commentators have said that Marx's ideas are relevant analytically, certainly, there are arguments then about the application, both of the analysis and how far they are relevant, given all the things that Tony describes. I think the responses from comrades have looked at that, but a couple of my own particular points is, of course, that that Marx was an internationalist, not just because of some sort of sentimental belief in the brotherhood of man, as it were, but because he saw capitalism as a world system. And he, when he was talking, for example, about colonialism and about the empires and so forth, he was, he was trying to show the way that capitalism was uniting the world, and that as a world system, it had to be, combated internationally, but also that the transformation had to take place on a world stage. And that the ideas of, particular areas, socialism in one country, for example, would have been a contradiction in terms as far as he was concerned. And it's because of that that I think of the world proletariat. And I think particularly of the proletariats of India, which I think Tony referred to, but also of a country like China, Nigeria, South Africa, and so on. So if we're looking for a proletariat, then we can find the traditional proletariat. The way I like to think of this, and maybe it's an unduly historicist way of looking at it, is that, of course, capitalism is constantly revolutionizing. And as it revolutionizes, it often moves on geographically. So, for example, the Netherlands and the Low Countries, Belgium and the Netherlands in the Middle Ages, were some of the most industrialized areas of Europe. Bohemia and Moravia were the same. And indeed, even inside England, the most industrialized areas until the 17th and 18th century were in southern England. So the movement around the globe or around a territorial area of capitalism isn't, I think, unusual. The question then is whether we've entered a qualitatively different form. And I think that it's clear that we are, as Steve Freeman and I think Matthew Jones referred to, we are living in the period of capitalist decline. That capitalist decline has been a feature since the 1870s and the 1880s, and that will throw up new forms. So I think that Marx's basic ideas still have relevance in that way, and the proletariat still exists. I think it still exists in Britain. It just has taken a different form. The decline of industry of the classic type doesn't mean to say that the proletariat, isn't there. And Tony, I know, isn't advocating that. We are, I suppose, in Hillel Ticktin particularly has written about this. We're in an era of a stalled transition. And again, Mark Lewis referred to the way that the Stalinist regimes and that type of politics has not only been an objective halt, but actually a subjective one as well. I think that if we're going to try to develop politics, then that's exactly what we have to do. We have, in a sense, not to think simply of some sort of determinism that given economic structures will throw up a particular economic form, and therefore there will be a type of inevitability. One of the little quotes that I put from the 18th Brumaire was that, you know, men make their own history, but not necessarily under conditions of their own choosing. And the point is that it is people that make history. So the subjective factor, the issues of consciousness, indeed of political activity, are absolutely crucial. And that means that socialist movements, trade unions, workers' organizations are absolutely decisive. If the triumph of socialism was inevitable, then Marx, Engels, or anybody else wouldn't need to bother. They would just wait for it to happen. So I think that subjective element there is still significant. But the answers that comrades have given about technologies and so on are also very true. In some ways, our ability to communicate has improved immensely. Not tonight, notwithstanding. But I also think the interconnectedness of the world and the way that proletariats and populations are linked together in that way. But I think this is a question that is well worth coming back to, particularly in response to the idea of what sort of politics we need in a world which is clearly different from Marx's, but also has some of those underlying features. And I suppose if you think about that world, you can see that the transition took many different forms in many different places. And Marx and Engels were trying to sort of address that as well. And just in some sort of smaller little points, I have seen the film Young Marx. It is worth viewing. It's not sort of terribly gripping in that sort of, drama sense. And a little bit of it is the, hello, my name is Proudhon. Oh, here, and he gives a bit of an exposition of the theory. I quite liked it. It's not widely available. You can buy it. It's in German with subtitles. That's fine. Zbigniew, your question on Adam Smith and so on, I think, is an interesting one. And I made the point that Marx drew from Smith's economics, but he did actually look at his wider philosophy, and indeed what we might loosely call bourgeois philosophy in general. And like other philosophers of that period, Marx was grappling with some of these problems about the relationship of the individual and society, particularly the nature of freedom and the ideas of our dependence and mutual relationship, and particularly the tension between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, between atomized individuals, pardon me, the individual ego, as it were, and then the collective. And your points about Hegel, I think, are quite right, that Marx is saturated in these ideas, and he's trying to look at the nature of man. So he sort of stands on the same sort of ground as these people. He's looking at the same questions, and he doesn't simply dismiss them as a bunch of bourgeois, and so on. He looks at their thought and looks at the weaknesses in it, particularly the idea of individualism and the individual ego and the egotistical individual, and indeed the relationship of individual freedom. And he uses ideas of freedom and of human happiness, quite widely, and how what sort of society can throw that up in that way. So I think that is quite quite an important theme. He wouldn't see himself as sort of going off. He starts from that point and moves and looks at the same sort of questions, the same sorts of points. And indeed, he uses many of the philosophical tools that that Hegel and so on, you know, gave him, but extends them in a different way. I began to lose contact with the meeting around the time of Steve Freeman, but I think his idea of process is important, and particularly of historical process. And one of the things that Marx, I think, was very keen to stress was this idea of processes and of these having often quite long historical origins and patterns. So if we're thinking about contemporary struggles, I think we need to look at those processes. We need to look at the economic and social changes, but we above all need to look at the subjective factor. If there is a criticism of, well, I mean, it is a criticism of some of the later arguments about Marxism, it is, I think, too much of an emphasis on, in a sense, the inevitable, and indeed a particularly simplified view of consciousness, which simply sees any given social structures throwing up a particular form of consciousness. That consciousness is mediated through culture, through religion, through different backgrounds. And we can see that when Engels is talking about the differences between the German socialist movement and the British one in that way. On Paul's point about colonialism and so on, Marx and Engels, and indeed many European socialists, have come in for criticism from some contemporary writers, from writers today, have suggested that that they were, in a sense, sort of pro-colonial, that indeed they were almost the archetypal dead white male, and that they tended to regard non-Europeans or colonies as people who would simply be swept aside by history. And I think this is unfair. I think that, again, we have a dialectical approach here. Marx, particularly in his writings on India, talks about the way that the British Empire links India to the most developed world economy. It draws it into the world market. Indeed, the Communist Manifesto talks about the way that capitalism unifies the world. And of course, as believers in a universal humanity, and particularly a universal class, the proletariat, anything that brings that class, is in a sense objectively to be supported. But that doesn't mean, I think, support for empire, and it doesn't mean support for imperialists, and indeed the repression of the imperialists. And that's particularly a case of Ireland. I will be looking at Marx and the nation, and perhaps the ideas of empire in that session a little later on. So I will go on to that. But certainly Marx does see capitalism as uniting the world or bringing the world together. And of course, the universal class that will emerge will be the proletariat, which will then unite humanity and unite humanity in the way that Enlightenment philosophers and indeed others had talked about the universal replacing the particular, the Gemeinschaft replacing the Gesellschaft, and that this would be on a global scale. On the question of feminism, well, Engels had relationships with the Burns sisters, Lizzie and Mary, and they were Irish people living in Manchester, and through them he had some connections with individual Fenians. There was a legend. It was a sort of persistent legend, but there's no proof for it, that there were actually some connections in the sense of putting people up or on the run and so forth. Those sort of survive in Manchester, and certainly Marx and Engels wrote extensively on Ireland. Engels had a plan for a history of Ireland. He made visits to Ireland. And Marx refers to his own daughters being enthusiastic Fenians. The reasons for their support for the Fenians and indeed their support for Irish self-determination, I will look at when I come to talk about the nation. But I suppose this is where we again look at some of the complexities and maybe some of the contradictions as well. Engels, in his writings about Eastern Europe, and Rostolsky, a Ukrainian Marxist, has written extensively on this, referred to non-historic peoples and seemed to suggest that some of the smaller nationalities of Europe would be absorbed into the larger nationalities. And again, you might argue that from the experience of the 1848-1849 revolutions, that might seem to be something of a tendency. So that sort of understanding of the nation and whether nationalism is progressive and its relationship to socialism, I think is something we will need to consider. In the Irish case, a blow against the British Empire, close to its heart, was considered by Marx and Engels to be absolutely decisive. Though again, depending on the time period, arguments for complete separation or arguments for federation and so on at different points. And again, this sort of relates, I suppose, to this idea of particular processes and that of politics and of positions evolving. Someone's just put in the chat about Fenians used in a derogatory way. No. In those days, Fenian was a term of honor. Marx's daughters wore green ribbons as a sign of their support for the Fenians. Just one last point that Mary Dwyer, I think, asked me about dialectical materialism. Well, I think we'll leave that one in some ways to the discussion that Matthew's going to do. It's one of those phrases which was applied really afterwards rather than by Marx or Engels themselves. I suppose the idea of materialism, which is philosophical materialism, which we're quite used to, it's the dialectical element and the idea of processes of change, and that those processes of change in the real world will then feed through into ideas and into politics and into patterns of human life. And I suppose what makes this different from other forms of dialectics is its rooting in the material world, but also that the material world is not fixed and immutable. So again, that idea that I was trying to put forward of processes of change and flux in that way. But this is also linked to the much wider debate, particularly around the role of later Marxists in turning Marxism into a rigid system, and the big academic debate on that, about whether Marxism was such a codified system. Indeed, I remember in the 60s and 70s, some comrades suggesting that because Marxism was scientific in this way, that it would be possible to actually use computing and vast levels of information to come up with the solution to various social problems, which seemed to me to be closer to utilitarianism and sort of British positivism than anything in Marxism. Certainly the subjective element, which is really what we've been talking about this evening, is I think the key one, political consciousness and the ability of people to change the world. And it's the ability to intervene and to develop political movements to change the world that I think is the significant lesson that we should take away. Anyway, I'm sorry for the very disjointed nature of this, and it's a great pity because I think the discussion was very good. And actually that probably says something about our general level of consciousness, that collectively we can achieve things without without the leaders like me spouting. So I'll look forward to some of the next sessions, and maybe we can take these questions up again. So
thank you very much, Kevin, for this positive ending there. I think we managed to pull it off. It was not without sweat or tears, but we pulled it off. We've got 9 more sessions, I believe, or I think 8 more sessions planned on the Marxism series until March the 11th. Next week, we're seeing Hilal Tikhtin, who's talking about what is a socialist society, which should be interesting as well. We've had a few comrades mentioning your 6 pages of notes, Kevin, that you've not used yet. And perhaps we have to consider slotting them in at some stage. There they are. Okay, slotting them in the series or at the end of the series, whatever. I'm sure we might be able to organize something. But thank you very much, Kevin. That was really good, as always. Thank you, comrades, for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you next Thursday. Bye-bye.
Bye.